A young Winston Churchill stands in a courtroom, his entire future at stake. His crime? Accused of acts of gross immorality of the Oscar Wilde type. In other words, homosexuality. It was 1896. Britain was still reeling from the trial of Oscar Wilde, the literary giant who had been sentenced to hard labour for engaging in homosexuality. His downfall had been swift, brutal, and absolute. And now, just a year later, a similar accusation was thrown at a young military cadet. The accusation came from a fellow officer who claimed Churchill had engaged in acts of gross immorality. A charge that, if proven, could end his military career, exile him from high society, and even send him to prison. But Churchill was not a man who accepted defeat. Unlike Oscar Wilde, who had been crushed by scandal, Churchill fought back. And what followed was a dramatic courtroom battle. So what really happened? Why was Churchill accused? Who was his accuser? And why do the whispers about his sexuality never truly go away? This is the story of Winston Churchill's secret scandal. Before Winston Churchill became the most famous wartime leader in British history, he was just another boy in the brutal, secretive world of British boarding schools. And if you want to understand how the rumours started, you have to understand what happened inside those walls. It was the late 19th century, and Britain's elite sent their sons to places like Harrow School, not just to be educated, but to be broken, rebuilt and hardened into proper English gentlemen. But behind the grandeur, behind the tradition, these schools had a dark side. They were cold, harsh, and ruled by an unspoken law. You either dominated or you were dominated. One of these traditions was called fagging, a system where younger boys were forced to serve older students. They ran their errands, cleaned their boots, prepared their tea, and in some cases endured far worse behind closed doors. It was a world of rigid discipline, brutal beatings and silent suffering. And in this environment, close male friendships weren't just common, they were inevitable. Some were innocent, others not so much. Winston Churchill entered Harrow as a misfit. He was rebellious, outspoken, and at times oddly theatrical. He didn't fit the mould of the cold, emotionless, upper-class Englishman, and that made him a target. He struggled academically, often ranking at the bottom of his class. But what really made him stand out were his friendships and his deep admiration for certain men, particularly his teacher, Robert Somervell. Somervell wasn't just any teacher. He was the first man to truly believe in Churchill. He helped the boy overcome his speech difficulties, encouraged his love for words, and inspired him to think beyond the rigid constraints of traditional schooling. Churchill adored him, and he wasn't afraid to show it. He wrote sentimental poetry. He spoke of Somervell with a kind of reverence that to modern eyes may seem perfectly normal. But in Victorian Britain, a society obsessed with policing masculinity, it was enough to make people talk. Churchill's admiration for certain male figures, his dramatic flair, his refusal to conform, these were all things that would later be used against him. Because in elite British circles, once a whisper started, it never truly disappeared. And years later, when Churchill was accused of gross immorality, those old whispers came roaring back. But that moment was still in the future. First, he had to escape Harrow, enter the military and prove himself as a soldier. What he didn't know was that one of his fellow officers would soon use his past against him. It started as a whisper, a rumour that crawled through the halls of the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. But by the time it reached the ears of Winston Churchill, it was a full-blown accusation. A fellow officer, A.C. Bruce Price, had accused Churchill of engaging in acts of gross immorality of the Oscar Wilde type. It was a dangerous phrase. It didn't need proof. It didn't need witnesses. It just needed to be said. And Churchill knew exactly what that meant. Just 1 year earlier, Oscar Wilde, Britain's most famous playwright, had been publicly humiliated, convicted, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour for being a homosexual. One day, Wilde was the toast of London. The next, a national disgrace, dragged through the courts, abandoned by his friends, and condemned to die in poverty. And now, a young Winston Churchill found himself standing at the edge of that same abyss. But why? Why would Bruce Price make such an accusation? What did he know? What had he seen? Was this a personal vendetta, or was there something more? No one knows for sure, but what we do know is this: Churchill was furious. Most men, especially those in Britain's upper class, would have stayed silent, hoping the scandal would fade. But Churchill, he went to war. He didn't just deny the accusation, he took Bruce Price to court, a lawsuit for defamation, a direct, aggressive counterattack. It was an all-or-nothing move, because if even a shred of evidence surfaced, if there was even a single witness who could confirm Bruce Price's claims, Churchill would be ruined forever. The case was sensational. Even though homosexuality was a taboo subject, the trial of Oscar Wilde had left Britain fascinated with scandal. The public watched closely, eager for any salacious details, but there were none. Bruce Price had no proof, no letters, no witnesses, no evidence of any kind. And that's when Churchill did something that no one expected. He demanded financial compensation. He wanted a public victory, a moment that would forever clear his name. And he got it. The court ruled in Churchill's favour, awarding him £400 in damages, the equivalent of nearly £50,000 today. The accusation was legally crushed, but Churchill had won more than just money. He had destroyed his accuser. He had proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the allegations were false. And yet, the whispers never truly went away, because even though he had won, the fact that he had been accused at all, that was enough to make people wonder. And decades later, as Churchill's power grew, so did the rumours. This would not be the last time his name was linked to scandal, because Churchill's closest friendships, his strangest allies, and his secret involvement in Britain's first discussion of gay rights would all come back to haunt him. And the next time the whispers started, they would be louder than ever. Winston Churchill had crushed the accusation against him. He had won his lawsuit, destroyed his accuser, and walked away with both his reputation and his military career intact. But some rumours never really die. Because, as Churchill's career soared, so did the whispers. Not because he was caught in another scandal, but because of the men he surrounded himself with. Men like the Glamour Boys, a group of aristocratic British MPs, many of whom were either openly gay or known for their flamboyant lifestyles. And in the conservative, tight-lipped world of British politics, these associations raised questions. If anyone kept the rumours about Churchill alive, it was Edward Marsh, a scholar, a poet, a lover of art and literature, and a man whose sexual orientation, though never publicly confirmed, was the subject of quiet speculation. Marsh was obsessed with Churchill, so much so that he volunteered to work for him for free when Churchill first entered politics. He handled Churchill's affairs, helped craft his speeches, and remained one of his most trusted confidants for decades. And Churchill? He adored Marsh. He once joked that if he ever got married, Marsh would have to be pushed aside. They exchanged heartfelt letters. Churchill valued Marsh's opinion more than most of his colleagues. And unlike other men in high society, Churchill never distanced himself from Marsh, even when people began to talk. But the rumours didn't just stem from Churchill's friendship with one man, because by the time World War II was looming, the Glamour Boys and Churchill were closer than ever. The Glamour Boys weren't just politicians, they were aristocrats, social elites, men who were often as well known for their parties as they were for their politics. But they were also some of the only men in Britain brave enough to stand against Hitler at a time when many of Churchill's own political rivals still viewed Nazi Germany as a potential ally. These men saw the rise of fascism for what it truly was, a threat to all of Europe, and they fought to stop it. Churchill too had been warning about Hitler for years, and when no one else would stand with him, the Glamour Boys did. But this alliance only fueled speculation. After all, Churchill had already been accused once. Now, as he fought to regain political power, people started asking questions. Why did Churchill surround himself with men widely suspected of being gay? Why did he work so closely with a group that had been labelled as unmanly by their enemies? Was it just a coincidence, or something more? The truth is, we may never know. But what we do know is this: Churchill never cared about the whispers. He didn't distance himself. He didn't change his allies. He didn't apologise. And years later, when Churchill had finally risen to power, those old whispers came back one more time. Because in 1954, Churchill did something that no one expected. He stood in a private cabinet meeting and questioned Britain's laws against homosexuality. He asked a simple, almost offhanded question: cannot we find a means to deal with this without putting them in prison? For 19th century Britain, those words would have been unthinkable. But this was the 1950s, and Churchill, now Prime Minister, had seen too many lives ruined by scandal, by gossip, by a society obsessed with moral policing. His words would eventually lead to the Wolfenden Report in 1957, the first step towards the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Britain. Had Churchill changed his stance? Was this the reflection of a man who had once been accused himself? Or was it simply an attempt to modernise British law? We may never know, but what we do know is this: Churchill was never a man who followed the rules, and whether you believe he was gay, bisexual, or simply indifferent to the subject, one thing is clear: he never let public opinion define him. He had been accused, he had been whispered about, but none of it mattered. Because when the moment came for Britain to be saved from Hitler, it wasn't the whispers that made history. It was Churchill himself. The 1896 accusation could have been the end of Winston Churchill. It could have derailed his career before it even began, leaving him as nothing more than a forgotten name in the history books, another scandal-ridden aristocrat doomed to obscurity. But Churchill did what few men of his time could. He fought back, and he won. The lawsuit silenced his accuser. The courts cleared his name. The damage was contained. And Churchill? He moved forward. He buried the scandal beneath a lifetime of war, politics, and history-making speeches. But history has a way of remembering whispers, especially the ones that never quite fade. So, was Winston Churchill gay? The question that never went away. In Churchill's lifetime, he was never caught in a compromising situation, never exposed in a scandal, never named in any secret letters or confessions. And yet, the rumours never truly stopped. Why? Because of the patterns. Because he surrounded himself with men who were known or suspected to be gay. Because he refused to distance himself from them, even when it could have hurt his career. Because he questioned Britain's anti-gay laws in 1954, decades before homosexuality was decriminalised. And because in the elite world of British aristocracy, once you had been accused, you were never truly innocent. The truth? We may never know. Historians have searched, speculated and debated, yet no evidence exists to prove Churchill was anything other than what he appeared to be, a man who defied expectations. He was sentimental, theatrical and deeply emotional in his friendships. He was also married, fathered children, and had passionate affairs with women throughout his life. Maybe the rumours were just a weapon, an easy way to smear an ambitious man who refused to conform. Or maybe, just maybe, Churchill was more complicated than history dares to admit.